In this video, I want to introduce the idea of animation in React. So we've got some simple animations going on here with hover. Specifically, we're using CSS transitions here, and you can use CSS transitions and CSS animations inside of your React like you would inside of a regular HTML project. But we're going to bring in a third-party library called Framer Motion, which is a really nice solution to setting up some animations inside of React, and it will allow us to do a lot of things quickly and easily that would be a little bit more difficult without a library. So I recommend digging into the documentation here. It explains a lot. The quick start takes you through setting up an animation inside of React, and the examples page shows you a bunch of cool examples with sandboxes that you can pop open. These are in Code Sandbox, and so you can like play around with the code, see how it works in a React application. We're going to go through this quick start together. We're going to do some demo animation components, and then we will bring this into our React application. And I want to bring it in two ways. One, I want to do a simple animation on our end page to like make the trophy page a little bit more exciting. And then we will get our fade transition working again. Previously in our HTML version of this game, our HTML, CSS, JavaScript version of this game, we had a fade transition, so things nicely like went from one question to the next. This is really jarring with the sudden transitions, so we'll fix that. Okay, so getting started, we need to install Framer Motion into our React application. So I'm going to kill my server, run npm install framer-motion, which when it finishes will give me Framer Motion in my project. And while that's running, we can take a look at some of the concepts. So we're going to import motion as a named import from Framer Motion. And then motion gives us a bunch of components. So animatable versions of div, paragraph, image, etc. All the basic HTML elements and also SVG elements. So with these, we pass in a prop, much like our style when we pass that in. We pass it in as an object. Here, the animate prop is an object where we specify a bunch of properties that we want to animate. So when you put this on the page, the animation will run to take you to a scale of 0.5 from whatever the default is. The default for elements would be a scale of 1, so this would go scale of 1 to 0.5. So this should have finished. We can start our server again. And what I want to do is, in our demos folder, create a new folder for animation. And let's create a new Framer Motion demos.js. And I'm just using my snippets to create this Framer Motion demos. Let's put a to-do note in here, and let's go back to our demos page. And let's add this onto that page. And if all went well, we should be able to go to demos and see our to-do note. So we've got something hooked up on that demo page so that we can use it here. So into this div, we'll create our first animation. So we're going to have to import motion from Framer Motion, and then we can use motion. It exports this object that we can use to create a motion version of any HTML element. You can see the IntelliSense popping up here. I just want a regular old div, so motion div. And let's put some text in there, like this is moving X, Y. So what we're going to do is use that animate property, and we can specify the X that we want to offset it to. So let's offset it 100 pixels to the right and 10 pixels down. Save it, Prettier kicks in. And here, if I refresh my page, anytime the page loads, we see this kick off. So if I flip back and forth, we can see it. It's basically starting at its normal position on the page, which would be here, and then offsetting 100 pixels over, 10 pixels down. So we can say moves from initial CSS settings to the animate property settings. Let's flip back to the docs here. And let's look at the animation documentation here. So it's telling us that, that motion export gives us ways to animate, and it gives us a way to configure how that thing animates. So here, this div is animating to a rotation of 360 degrees, and it's taking 2 seconds to do that transition. So we can come back to our code and try another one. We can do a motion.div animate, and let's do a scale animation. So we'll animate to a scale of 0.5 with the transition that has a duration of 1 second. And let's say scaling in here. So now it scales over 1 second from a scale of 1 to a scale of 0.5. So let's add a comment. We can control the transition properties of the animation via transition. And there's a whole lot more that we can set for this transition. And to figure that out, we just look at the documentation. So for the transition, the information on the transition, you kind of want to dig into the API here and click on transition. And this tells you all of the different properties you can set. So you can set a delay to have that transition trigger after a certain number of seconds. You can have it stagger and delay child elements if you want like list items to show up one after one another. You can change how it repeats. You can have it repeat for a duration. You can have it repeat endlessly and have it go back and forth as it's doing its repeating. So let's set this one up to use maybe repeat, and let's do 2 and see what happens. So you can see that repeat has our animation repeating 2 times after that initial animation. And it is repeating by just jarringly coming back to a scale of 1 after it scales down to 0.0. So that's where this repeat type comes in. This repeat type loop makes you just sort of reset to the start. Reverse allows you to kind of smoothly go back and forth between those. So let's try adding a repeat type of reverse. There we go. And so it should run, let's see here, 1. Yeah, so that's repeating twice. We're having some weird behavior when we didn't have this in here. Change this back to loop to see what happens. That's interesting to see. So if we don't specify our repeat type of reverse, we seem to be getting it actually happening 3 times versus just the 2 times here. So that repeat property seems like it's actually telling us how many times it'll repeat after that initial transition. All right, let's try one more here. Whoops. Oh, that emit expansion didn't work properly. So let's not use that. So we can create a div here that rotates. And the initial here allows us to specify what the starting values are. So when we said animate to scale of 0.5, it animated from whatever the default is when this component was mounted to the page. Since we have no other CSS that's applying to that div, it's just a scale of 1. So here we can actually say like this starts at a particular rotation and moves to another rotation. So actually maybe we'll start it upside down. We'll start it at a rotation of 180 and let's animate it to a rotation of 0. So starts upside down and then kind of swings on a hinge into position. The origin allows you to set the origin for these transformations like the rotation. So here, 0, 0, we're saying rotate around the top left. If I put in 0.5, 0.5, this is now going to animate around the midpoint of this div. And this div takes up the full width of the page, so that does some, funky behavior here. So let's have it hinge around the top left. And we can also configure that transition, and there's all sorts of types for the transitions. If we go back to the docs here, we can control how the animation runs using tweens, which allow us to set an easing and a duration. This is kind of like standard animation terminology. Don't worry if you're not familiar with it. It basically is a way to mathematically move from one value to another with different kind of like energies. These describe how you move from one value to another. But you can also set up a spring. So a spring is a different type of animation where you actually tell it like, hey, model this physically as if it were a spring using some math equations for how springs work, and specify the dampening and stiffness and mass of that animation so that it animates like a real life object. So I'm going to break these out onto new lines so that's a little easier to see here. I'm going to go for a type of spring here, and I'm going to say that the dampening is maybe 10, and the stiffness is maybe 100. And let's check that out. So you can see that moves much differently than the previous version we had. The previous version, if I go ahead and get rid of this transition, was the default tweening, moves pretty quickly, snaps into position, and our spring transition here moves a bit differently and kind of overshoots and then settles into the final position. And let's do one more here. So let's annotate this to say we can control the starting state via initial. And so that we can have one where we're doing something other than a div. We could animate something inline, like do a motion span. And let's do a color animation. So we could say that the color should start at RGB 00255, which would be all blue. And make sure that we spell initial right. And then animate. We can set the color to go to, let's do RGB green, so all 255 in the green channel. And let's have it repeat infinitely. So I'm just picking that because I know the documentation tells us to use infinity inside of the transition if we want it to repeat infinitely. And let's do the reversing type here. So we should get some text that starts as blue, goes to green, but then keeps going back and forth. There we go. So that's a crash course in some of the basics here of using motion. Digging in deeper, it's just a matter of reading the documentation, looking at some examples, and sort of looking for the customizations that you want in your application. I recommend checking out the introduction, the examples, the animation page here, which describes that motion div and what properties it accepts, and then digging into like the transition type when you want to look at more of how you can control moving from state to state. And then down here, we're going to dig into animate presence in a second. But with this knowledge, we can add something fun to the final page of our quiz game. So for testing purposes, what I want to do is go to our quiz, and I want it to start in the game over state. So I'm just modifying the initial state here so that as soon as the game starts, we're on our quiz complete page. So we can now test an animation on this page. And I just want to go to the end screen, and our trophy here, I want to convert to a motion div and have it do like a rotation. So we can import motion from Framer motion and turn this div into a motion.div. And I'm just using Visual Studio's built-in rename feature. So I'm just selecting the tag, hitting F2, and then I'm able to rename these tags. Like if I want to change this to an H2, hit F2, and then I can do that easily. Okay, so this is now a motion div. The class name will still be applied. So our styling here that bumps up the emoji and adds some margin, still working, but we can now add all of the other motion properties that we want. So I'm just going to spread this out over multiple lines so it's a little bit easier for me to type out. We want to start this rotation at 0. Let's set up the origin x to be 0.5, the origin y to be 0.5. Let's have it animate to a rotation of 360. So it'll do one flip. And we can set up the transition to be one of those spring transitions. So we could basically just use that spring that we set up on the previous page with a dampening of 10 and a stiffness of 100. And now anytime the page loads, we got our little trophy animation here. So you could use this structure to sprinkle in animation throughout all of your application to sort of add some whimsy and some fun to our design here. What I want to dig into now is one of the things that is more challenging in React, but that Framer Motion makes pretty easy, and that is transitions. So when we go from this component, the end screen being on the page, to our first trivia item being on the page, to our second trivia item being on the page, those are jarring, immediate transitions. There is nothing animating here, And the reason why this is happening is this is just how React works by default. As soon as you say something should not be on the page, React goes ahead and removes it from the page. As soon as we stop returning it from the render, from our functional components return, it's gone, which is great because it makes it easy for us to sort of dynamically switch between content, but is not great for animation because that means that if we wanted to transition from one thing to another, we can't remove it from our return. We have to somehow like put it into an inactive state and run some animation on it. And then when it's done, remove it from the page. That's a pain to set up yourself, which is why Framer Motion has a Animate Presence component. So the Animate Presence component allows you to create a parent that you put on the page and then put your motion elements in them in this Animate Presence component. And when these are added and removed from the page, they run their transition. So when they appear on the page, they start in their initial state and move to their animated state. That's their enter transition. And then when they leave the page, they move from animate to exit. So you can see here, things are starting slightly off here and sliding into the page. And when they leave, they start in wherever they are on the page and then slide off to the left. And that's this X going from 300 to 0 to negative 300, and our opacity going from 0 to 1 to 0. So the Animate Presence component is that thing that I was mentioning is hard to do, is sort of like monitoring when things are removed from the rendering. Animate Presence basically like caches those things and makes sure that they get animated as they're leaving, not that they just disappear immediately. So we need to set, or we can set this up for our transitions here. So we'll wrap all of this in an Animate Presence, and then each question or end screen can be wrapped in a motion div that does this fading for us. So let's go back to our game. And we can make sure that we start with the game not over. So just reset that. And then up here, let's go ahead and import motion and animate presence from Framer Motion. So following that example that we saw, what we need to do is take our content that we want to animate, and that needs to be in an Animate Presence component. And then our content, we should wrap it in like a div where we can specify those properties that are going to be animated. So let's create a motion div that we put our page content into. So this div, we can pass in the initial state, and we're going to specify the animate state, which is these two together define our enter animation. So what happens when something shows up on the page? Starts in initial, goes to animate, and then our exit would be when that thing is being unmounted from the page or being removed from the page. And let's also specify a transition here. So to start, let's get the opacity from 0 to an opacity of 1. And when it leaves, it should go back to 0. And let's have this happen over 0.5 seconds. So you can see now, when I load up the quiz, our enter animation kicks off and our thing nicely fades onto the page. But we don't have that exit transition working just yet. So one of the really important things in this structure is that we need to make sure that each thing that we're animating gets a key so that the Animate Presence knows how to identify each thing that we have put inside of it. So it uses the key to keep track of like, oh, this is a new thing that's been added, so I'm going to fade that in and I'm going to get rid of the old thing that was there. So each time this structure is the same currently for whatever the page content is. But if we want this page content to be wrapped in a unique motion div, we have to apply a key here based on whatever the content is. So we could use like the trivia index here to sort of identify which question we're on. So when we render for index 0, one div would be created around our content, and when we render for index of 1, a new div is created for that new content, and Animate Presence is responsible for making sure that those two things fade in and out at the right time. So that key is really important. If you forget that, you're going to end up with exit transitions that don't work. And you can see this is working, except that our content is showing up on the page at the same time. And this is where that Animate Presence component has a property here. Exit before enter. So if we use this, that is going to enforce that only one child can be on the page at a time. So the previous thing will be removed before the new thing is added. So on our Animate Presence, we can say exit before enter, true. And that should set it up here so that we go from question to question. The one problem we're going to run into is when we get to our last question and we go to our final page, that key is broken. When we're putting our final page content as end screen on there, the key, the trivia index, is the same as it was for the last trivia item that was on the page. So actually what we need to do for this key is make sure that we create a variable here, and when we're on the end screen, we can set that key to be end screen. And when we're moving to a specific trivia item, we can set that to be the trivia index here. And then we can use this page key down here. So when we put this content on the screen, it's got a unique key. And when we put this content on the screen, our trivia item, it's always going to have a unique key that's based on which question we're loading. So now all of this stuff has unique keys, so all of our transitions should work. And for testing purposes, let's go ahead and go back to our data and slice it so that we only have a couple on the page. There we go. So we could improve this animation. If we come back to our game, we could add a little bit of that horizontal movement that we saw in the example. So we could start this at an X of 75. So it'll be 75 pixels over to the right, move into its normal X position of 0. And then when it leaves, we can move to negative 75. So it slides off to the left. So this is kind of similar to the animation that we set up in our previous HTML, CSS, JavaScript version. We can also specify individual transitions here. So if I wanted the transition for going from the initial to our animate to be a transition that is eased with ease out, I can do that. And if I want the transition for the exit here to be ease in, I can control that too. And if you wanted, you can make them springs. They don't have to be the tween easing transition. So with Motion Framer, it was pretty easy to implement a few different types of animations, like these simple animations and also these transitions between our components. the last thing that I want to do is just take a look at what we wrote and see if we can refactor it. Looking at this structure, the game component here has a lot of information in it about animation. And I don't think that that's really the game component's responsibility to have all of this animation content in it. So what I'd like to do is create a new component here. Let's call it fade transition.js. And I want it to take this content. So we're going to create fade transition that'll take in some props. And we're also going to create the fade wrapper, which takes in some props. And let's paste in our reference. Whoops, didn't mean to do a JS comment. So here's what we had before. We have to have this parent component that is an animate presence around a motion div component. So my fade wrapper, I want to have that set up to create an animation presence component. And then my fade transition will be this motion div. So our fade wrapper will return this animate presence. I'll make sure that I import animate presence here. And whatever we give it as children, it should throw those here. So fade wrapper is just kind of like a shortcut for us creating this animation, animate presence with the exit before enter. And then our fade transition, I want to set up here to do this motion div. So make sure that I auto import motion here. And looking at what we created, this content, whatever's here, this will again be children. So whatever gets passed into the fade transition should just show up as the child of this animation. And then we got to make sure that we can get this key specified. So we'll take a unique key as a prop and pass that in here. So if we look at what we created before, this is going to end up becoming fade wrapper instead of animate presence, and then fade transition instead of all of this. And what we need to make sure that we do is pass in that unique key here. And that was like our page key variable. So we're going to go from our game having all of this stuff in it to something a little tidier that sort of hides away the implementation details of how the fade works and hides them away in this fade transition module. So I'm going to export, and we're going to do a named export here. Export the fade wrapper and the fade transition so that both of these are available to anyone who imports this. Because these are both linked, we'll just keep them in the same file here. So now we can go ahead and remove that planning comment. And if we go back to our game, we can bring in our fade wrapper and bring in our fade transition, pass in the key, the unique key of page key here, and then just move our content in there. And if we did this correctly, it should still work to fade in and out across our pages. And this is a more reusable structure here. Our game component doesn't have to care about the implementation details. It needs to know that it needs to use fade wrapper and fade transition, but we've kind of tucked away all the implementation details. And if we ever need to change the fade transition, we just come in here and modify some of these. Like if we wanted it to go a crazy far distance as it was doing its animation, that's easy to do by just modifying that one component. Oh, and you know what? I have made a mistake here because I can see my exit transition. I tried to make that drastic change here, and it is sliding in but not sliding out. So I have messed up something here. Oh, yes. Okay, here we go. So this actually doesn't need to be passed in as a prop. What I want to do here is just use the default key property that is built into React. So let's see, there we go. Now we've got our crazy slide in and slide out working. So last thing I'll do in this video is go into our fade transition and let's add our documentation to these two elements so that someone consuming this module knows actually how to use this. So I'm going to use my JS doc structure here to create, let's actually start with the fade wrapper. This wraps around a fade transition. If you want enter and exit transitions, be sure that you put your fade transition inside of a fade wrapper. And then the parameter here is an object, props, and it has a children prop that it accepts, and the type comes from React. It is a React node. So if we hover over fade wrapper here, we can see what it takes as parameters, and we can see our little notation about what this component does. And if we hover over here, we would see that too. And we can JS doc this one. Similar structure here for the children. And let's also make a note here. Be sure to wrap this in a fade wrapper component, and be sure to assign the fade transition a unique key. And then let's wrap this line. So now we should see our documentation popping up here, that it takes in children, and we got our little note about needing to assign a key. So there we go. We went through the process of reading some of the Framer motion docs. This is a great library. Dig deeper into this. I'll have some links below the video for more information. And we were able to add a couple different types. We added a kind of simple animation here, and then a more complex fading animation that we set up to be its own module, a set of components inside of a module here to tuck away the implementation details. Just reset that to 75 before we finish this up. So that's all for this video. You've got Framer Motion available to you as you're working on your projects to bring in small and large animations into your designs.